So looking at greenhouse gas emissions within farming in some more detail here, 5-year periods going back to 1990. We've also put in a projection as well to 2040, which is seen by NFU as the target for achieving net zero emissions in agriculture. And we've got it broken out by greenhouse gas and the total net emissions overall. And you can see here methane is quite significant, contributing about 56% of the overall gross emissions coming from the agricultural sector. So very much the area that where decreases need to be seen into the future. And along the bottom here, we've also got a mitigating effect taking place by CO2 sequestration from grassland in particular, but also from land use more generally. An allowance has been made there to take out the settlements from that. We can see overall sequestration levels just short of 20 million tonnes in the UK. I think just over 16 million tonnes overall. And I think that needs to be a focus area for the future if the UK is going to achieve its net zero target. So in gross terms, that can vary from anywhere between 8 to 30 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilo of beef. But that's very much concentrating on the gross level. Now, some studies do consider the sequestration potential, but it's very much based on a global level, and that tends to be between 13 to 20% of overall gross emissions. But many studies do not take it into account. And of course, if you're a farm that's producing relatively green or relatively low carbon beef versus the overall global average or versus some of the higher emitters, that sequestration taking place on land will account for a greater proportion of that. And examples in Northern Ireland, some of the studies that have been done there, it is believed that anywhere between 1 to 3 tonnes of CO2 equivalent are being sequestered by the grassland each year. And if we plot that against the gross emissions from the beef, that can be anywhere between 13 to 40% approximately of those gross emissions. From a consumer perspective though, the way it should work should be that you should compare the net impact of beef versus the net impact from an alternative protein source. And that should give you an overall CO2 saving. But what you more often see is that it's compared to the overall gross emission from beef. Or in some cases even, people are convinced that if they stop consuming beef, that they're not going to have a CO2 footprint arising from that. Well, the alternative sources of protein are also going to have a carbon footprint associated with them. But here we have included some examples in terms of on-farm measures that can be undertaken. More grassland, CO2 being sequestered from that through better grazing management, for instance. People believe that the scope for improvement there, the range that I mentioned in terms of Northern Ireland, 1 to 3 tonnes, points towards that as well. But there's also a role for genetics and genomics programs. And the savings that people believe is possible there is in the region of 20% reduction in the emissions potential over the lifetime versus standard genetics in the beef herd. So again, tools such as this need to be brought into consideration, and that in turn can lower the overall CO2 emissions coming from beef. And in addition to that, we also need to look at certain areas of the land, certain areas of farms might be poorer performing, might be more costly to produce grass from those. Converting those into woodland, in many cases, can also have an impact. And that also can help with regards to the animal, providing a shelter belt, greater welfare, for instance, and also improving the daily live weight gain, which in turn can reduce the overall time to slaughter. So again, that can have a positive impact on emissions overall.